It's no secret that the Sonic franchise's reputation has had its ups and downs over the 3-ish decades of its existence. There's a lot of reasons for this, but you can really feel how this affected how people saw the games and characters in a lot of different ways if you start looking for it. One place where I think this starts to really bleed through, as strange as it might sound, is actually on everyone's favorite power scaling web series, Death Battle. Now, Death Battle itself has been going for about a decade and a half now, and it's grown a lot as a web series in several ways. The Sonic franchise has had episodes on the show starting from the earliest seasons all the way to now, and the changing reputation of the franchise, as well as the growth of Death Battle as a show, has had a really noticeable impact on how these episodes are made. So, as a retrospective both on how the internet in general has seen Sonic as a franchise and how this particular web series has grown over the last decade or so, I wanted to take a look at every episode of Death Battle featuring a Sonic character and talk about them. Fair warning, I will be skipping Trunks vs Archie Silver and Wally West vs Archie Flash, simply because I want to avoid Archie spoilers. Anyway, that's enough intro yapping, let's get started. The first Sonic episode of Death Battle, interestingly, doesn't feature Sonic himself. Instead, their first appearance on the show is in Vegeta vs Shadow, episode 12 of Death Battle. It's worth noting before we even start that at this time, the point of Death Battle was very different. It was more supposed to be funny than it was supposed to be dramatic or cool, though those were still elements of the show. This is probably why it had this very violent aesthetic early on, with tons of child-friendly characters getting absolutely wrecked on screen simply for shock value. That was like the funniest thing on the entire internet back in 2010. Remember llamas with hats, guys? That was the energy around the internet at the time of Death Battle's first season, and the main reason for this entire matchup was simply to make a joke.
Tell me, Hedgehog, does a lab rat like yourself experience fear?
You have no idea who you're dealing with?
What's this?
Behold the true power I possess!
Wow, what a ripoff.
Funnily enough, they would go on to reference the joke in just about every Sonic episode of the show going forward. But yeah, that's how most episodes of DB were back in the day, so you kind of have to look at the episodes for what they were. As for the episode itself, it has the same charm as a lot of early Death Battle episodes, where there's so clearly just a few guys having fun with characters they love. This is actually the first episode of the show to have voice acting in the animation itself, which is a pretty big milestone. The analysis isn't very accurate. They pull a ton of stuff out of nowhere for both of the characters' rundowns, and according to what they say in that section of the video, they do lowball both of the characters pretty horribly, but also that's not the point. The point was to get to watch Shadow and Vegeta fight, specifically DBZ abridged Vegeta, and the fight animation is extremely charming despite how basic it is. I kinda love the idea that Vegeta is so spiteful that he would risk destroying the entire planet just to get back at this one irritating hedgehog. It is kind of out of character, but again, this was more of a parody animation than it was an earnest what if these characters met and fought like the show turned into over time, so it's fine. I also do like the bit with Shadow teleporting Vegeta a few times with Chaos Control. Overall, it's a fun watch, if only for nostalgia and seeing what used to get you 16 million views back in the day. I'll give it 4.5 out of 7 Dragon Balls. It's a good starting point for this discussion. Following up Vegeta Shadow is Mario Sonic, a matchup that everyone wanted to see before the show even started. I think you can tell they wanted to put more effort into this episode than some of the surrounding episodes and take it more seriously than a lot of the joke episodes surrounding it. Apparently they were considering making this the finale to season 1 before it became Goku Superman, and the fact that this was even considered for something like that shows the level of importance they put on this episode. It does have sort of the same tone as Vegeta Shadow, but there's much more effort given to actually explaining how the matchup would go, which is to say, literally any effort whatsoever. For some reason, early on in Death Battle, a lot of the conclusions were less conclusions and more summaries of the fight animation you just watched happen, which makes them pretty pointless in the grand scheme of things. However, this one at least contains some reasoning for why the matchup went the way it did, explaining how the power-ups canceled each other out and that Sonic's better base stats allowed him to prevail. It's a bit of a shaky conclusion in all honesty, and it wasn't explained in that much detail, but it's better than what we got before it, so we'll take this. I do really want to extrapolate more on the charm that this episode has. This was all animated, to my knowledge, by Ben Singer, and you can tell just how much he cared about what he was doing with how many little details he went the extra mile to add in. The entire montage of Mario and Sonic fighting may feel weird nowadays with how most DB animations go, but it was included specifically to allow them to show off more power-ups just for fun. Also, the whole bit with Sonic drowning and then going supersonic is really well done for how primitive all of this is. It doesn't make much logical sense though. Like, why did Sonic not just go super immediately once he realized he was starting to drown if he had all 7 emeralds on him? It's not like he found one of them at the bottom of the lake or something. That is a nitpick though, I just think it's kind of funny. The final note I have for this episode is that it's just so obvious what a huge Archie Sonic fan Ben is. Listen to how he introduces Sonic in this episode.
Sonic the Hedgehog is the fastest thing alive and a freedom fighter battling to save the world from the tyrannical Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik.
He's not so bad for a tree-hugging hippie.
He's not just a hero who fights Eggman, he's specifically a freedom fighter who fights Ivo Robotnik. That and the note about how Sonic is an embodiment of chaos after absorbing so many power rings are references to things that I happen to know happened in Archie Sonic specifically. That's, again, the thing that really carries the early episodes of the first season. The pure passion that comes through in them. My only real complaint about this episode is that I don't love all the blood on the kill. I generally think that the more cartoony characters on Death Battle should lean into their source material and go a bit light on the gore. The kill here is both extremely sudden and really brutal. Honestly, it just feels out of nowhere and out of place. Still, the episode is a fun watch. I'll give it 5 out of 7 super mushrooms. Following up on Mario Sonic is Eggman vs. Wily, the last episode animated by Ben himself. The episode is just really fun throughout, honestly. This episode has a much longer rundown than the previous two, which makes sense as they have a lot more ground to cover as this is a full army battle. They not only talk about the men themselves, but also their creations. While a lot of these are really short, there's a lot more good jokes in here and some more substantial information on the characters. The rundowns are overall a substantial improvement from the previous episodes. As for the animation itself, it's very limited but still extremely admirable. Ben isn't like an artist or anything. He learned how to animate in order to create this show, and it's honestly cool what he was able to accomplish just by himself with enough effort. Still, this wasn't a particularly scalable way of doing things, and this episode was meant to show both what Ben could accomplish, while also showing how he was brushing up against the limits of his skill set. It's his swan song, and it's a good episode to go out on. Like most of Ben's animations, it's carried mostly by its creativity and humor. The gag with Scratch and Grounder is something that sticks out to me. It's probably the best possible way you could use them in an animation like this. The fight also has a great energy to it, constantly switching between different combatants with a snappy pace that makes it feel a lot more fast-paced than it actually is. And I also like the ending of the episode quite a bit. It's a bit more experimental. In some ways, the entire episode is, and you can tell how the cast is slowly getting better at making the show over time. Now, I know I did preface this entire video by talking about Sonic's reputation and all that, and I know I haven't actually talked about that topic too much yet, but trust me, we're getting there. We just have a bit more ground to cover before things start to change. Overall, I'm going to give this episode 6 out of 7 E-takes. It's absolutely the best they could have done at the time, but it was clear they were rubbing up against their limitations. On to the last episode of Death Battle and what I'm going to call this era of the show, Tails Luigi. This is a pretty big upgrade in terms of animation quality, and I think that's kind of it. The rundowns are standard fare, though I do find them saying that Luigi is subservient to Mario really weird, since it's never even portrayed like that in the games. They're just brothers, they help each other out, you know? There's no need to make it weird. I will say that the lack of any real tangible information about the strength of the characters in either of the rundowns or the conclusion is a lot less excusable at this point. The show was beginning to transition from a parody animation to an actual versus debate show around season 2, and not giving any meaningful information about the characters on that front makes it kind of a bad episode as a versus show. Still, it isn't quite as bad as season 1 where they just made stuff up consistently, but like, that's not that high of a bar to clear. As for the animation, it's fine, but it has a lot of notable problems. While the animation quality is overall a lot higher, there are just some things in the animation that feel weird or don't make much sense. The sequence where Tails lifts Luigi into the air and Luigi uses the Vanish Flower or whatever it's called does stick out. Why does Tails not know where Luigi is? He's still holding him. How does he not see the hammer? Why does the question mark box and subsequent exclamation point box take so long to appear? The kill here is also weird. It starts with Tails running up to Luigi after an explosion and them having a bit of a standoff. Then, as Luigi pulls out his hammer, Tails steps out of the way and his magic arm contraption extends and punches Luigi through the chest. Again, I feel like the blood here is excessive, but it's whatever. It's standard at this point in the show. I do think this entire sequence doesn't really scan, though. I think it's supposed to show Tails outsmarting Luigi by hiding his attack behind his body or something, but like, Luigi was expecting Tails to attack him, so he would be prepared for an attack from that direction. Why would sidestepping to attack him with something behind you blindside him if he's already expecting danger from that direction? I don't know, it just doesn't feel like it works to me. The animation is still mostly fun. Luigi has a ton of personality, but it feels like Tails wasn't utilized as well as him. Luigi gets to show off his scaredy cat side while pulling off some cool moves. However, Tails is kind of just a stoic badass the entire time, which is cool, but it feels very one-sided. I think they did an okay job showing Luigi's more comedic personality while also giving him some cool moments, but maybe they could have shown some of Tails' naivete or maybe show how he's easily spooked still due to his age. I know some people don't like that part of Tails' character, but I really think that's just due to forces doing his character super dirty. In the right context, having Tails still be young and inexperienced is fine, and it's a part of his character to this day in the series. It's also something they emphasize a lot in the rundown, but don't really show in the animation at all. The animation kind of shows Tails as if he's this stoic action hero, and Luigi is an affable doofus who barely manages to scrape by, and it just doesn't work as well for me as it could have if it were more balanced. Despite all that, I still enjoyed the episode. I think in context, it's slightly more disappointing than the previous episodes. Whereas episodes like Eggman vs. Wily, where everyone on the team firing on all cylinders, I feel like they could have done a little bit better with this one. There are good moments, good humor, and the animation hides its low budget well, but it's just an average episode. Oh, also they rely on the Mario and Sonic power-ups counteract each other thing here, and I just don't buy that. I could go into it more, but like, if you're just giving the Mario crew standard power-ups and not Power Stars or Grand Stars, the Chaos Emeralds are way stronger than any of the power-ups alone. Like, that's not super relevant here, but still. Overall, the episode is really average. I'll give it 4.5 Chaos Emeralds out of 7. Before we go on, I think we need to take a quick look back on the Sonic episodes of Death Battle we've seen so far. You'll see why in just a bit, but I think there's one thing that becomes really clear when you look at all of these episodes at once. These guys just really love Sonic the Hedgehog. You can just see the passion for the source material oozing out of a lot of early episodes of Death Battle. And there's obviously a lot of love for the Mario and Mega Man franchises and all of the other franchises we've seen so far. but most of these episodes have been incredibly personal in some sense, and that gives them a sort of charm that's difficult to replicate. Newer episodes of Death Battle are a lot better, but the level of professionalism that they have nowadays makes the love for the franchises cooked into them come across differently, or in some unfortunate cases, get lost entirely. These early episodes have an unreplicatable feel to them, though a big part of that is knowing that over a decade later, we would get some really incredible stuff from these guys. It's just nice to look at the humble beginnings of the show every once in a while, you know? Besides that, I think that looking at just how much Ben and the rest of the crew love Sonic gives a lot of important context for what comes later on. There are some people I've seen claim that Death Battle is biased against Sonic as a franchise thanks to, well, a lot of factors, but much of it comes down to the rather unfortunate losing streak that the franchise has on the show. I just want to point out that of the 4 episodes we've seen so far, in an era of the show that was far less based on research and much more on vibes and bias, the franchise currently has a 3-1 record. If anything, I feel like may have been biased in favor of the Sonic cast. Still, there are some other factors at play here, other things that make people feel like the show is biased against Sonic. And I think a lot of that comes down to the next topic of discussion. The overall reputation of the Sonic franchise around this point on the internet. Tails vs. Luigi was released on March 22nd, 2014. The next episode featuring a Sonic cast member is DK vs. Knuckles, released on August 12th of 2015. Crucially, between these 2 episodes, a very important Sonic game was released. Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. This game was a PR disaster for the franchise, especially on YouTube. The franchise was already in hot water thanks to people rediscovering how awful Sonic 06 was through YouTube reviews, which were really popular around this time, but the release of Rise of Lyric really killed a lot of the goodwill that was left for Sonic. To put it simply, they did it again. They killed a Sonic game by releasing it in an unacceptably buggy state, and also missed completely on the tone and story that fans wanted. It's worth pointing out that at the time, the Boom series was seen as almost a replacement for normal Sonic. We didn't really know that Forces was coming for a long time, and people were worried that the old version of these characters were gone for good. Having them unceremoniously replaced with these versions in a game that just kinda sucked was not a good look. Nowadays, people look on Boom a lot more favorably, and that's due to a lot of factors. We know that the franchise isn't going to be Boom forever, so people are more okay to see different takes on the Sonic cast, and I think most people have forgiven the entire brand for Rise of Lyric, thanks to the TV show convincing a lot of people that this side of the franchise can be entertaining. But at the time, people kind of hated Sonic. Or at least they got more enjoyment out of pretending to hate Sonic than they did out of the material itself. This leads into DK vs. Knuckles, and I think this explains why some of the decisions were made when making this episode. At least, I think it might. Before we even talk too much about it, I just have to say that the matchup itself doesn't feel right to me. DK and Knuckles don't actually have that many parallels besides just being physically strong. Donkey Kong isn't a protector in a meaningful way. Yeah, he guards his banana horde, but that's just like his stuff. He doesn't like it when people steal his stuff, you know? Knuckles has like a sacred duty to protect the Master Emerald. Also, a big part of this matchup is the idea that both of these characters are really, really dumb, which honestly I think is out of character for both of them. DK isn't a smart character and he is goofy, but he's not usually shown to be actively stupid. Bowser has done more stupid stuff than DK in all honesty. Knuckles also isn't dumb. He's kind of naive thanks to being raised in complete isolation, but he's crafty when it comes to a fight. It's hard to strike the right balance, but Knuckles is a character who's very smart in some ways and very dumb in others. Except for in Boom, where he is just an idiot meathead. The games did play up Knuckles being dumb before Boom, but never to the same degree. Canon Knuckles is able to remember all of the various secret passageways on Angel Island and navigate them easily. Boom Knuckles doesn't know left from right. There's a pretty big gap there. This all sort of taints the entire episode for me. It feels a lot more mean-spirited in a lot of ways than previous episodes of Death Battle with Sonic characters, and it feels more mean-spirited than a lot of other episodes generally. I don't want to let my distaste for the premise behind this matchup taint my opinion too much, but even then, I really don't agree with the idea that these are two stupid characters, which this video really pushes. That's enough preamble though, we should probably get into the episode itself more properly. The rundowns are a lot better than previous episodes. They're higher energy, more entertaining, even when just explaining basic concepts, and they have more direction than a lot of previous episodes. That's the main difference between more modern Death Battle rundowns and the original ones. In the past, they were mostly just a checklist, going over everything in a set order and trying to communicate that information with some jokes thrown in. Nowadays, most rundowns have a sort of thesis that they center around. Everything is designed to sort of build to a conclusion, while sprinkling in all the information you need to know on the way. These rundowns do that fine, though they do focus a lot more on how dumb the characters are, as that's the theme of the episode, and again, I don't really like that. It goes as far as to pull jokes from Boom to say that Knuckles is illiterate and whatnot, and I suppose we didn't know as well how canon worked at this point, but Boom was always clearly a reboot. This is sort of a different can of worms when it comes to versus debating, and Death Battle has a history of compositing characters for their episodes, which I don't really like for a lot of characters, but I just think it's worth pointing out that when it came to compositing Knuckles, they chose to specifically choose these one-off gags from Boom over the rest of the franchise. Still, in terms of going about making the points it's trying to make, it does a good job. It is a more well-written rundown, even if the points within it are things I don't particularly like. The animation has its ups and downs. The main issue is that Donkey Kong just looks fucking atrocious. His sprites are just so ugly and uncanny, and it literally ruins this entire thing for me on its own. That's maybe a harsh critique, but I can't really change how I feel about it. Even when he's well animated, the sprite itself is so uncanny, it makes me uncomfortable, and I would dislike this animation on that front alone. Besides that problem, it does at least do a few good things though. There's some genuinely good choreography in this fight, and it's upping the ante from the last episodes a lot, with more dynamic shots and strategies. You can see DK get the idea to use his coconut gun from a coconut falling on his head, which is a cute detail, and a lot of the fight has that sort of flow to it. One really strange thing is Knuckles attempting to bury DK by burrowing underground and collapsing the ground under him. It's a cool strategy and something I could actually see Knuckles doing, but it's also like a smart move that takes forward thinking and planning, which they specifically say that he doesn't do. So while this is a good showing of Knuckles as a character, it's also kind of contradicting the rest of the episode, and I'm not sure how to feel about that. The final bit with DK digging himself out of the ground with Knuckles' dismembered limbs is also just overly violent for this series. I understand there being some blood in these episodes, it's a death battle, but I just don't think you should revel in the violence like this. Overall, the entire episode just feels mean-spirited towards the characters in a bad way. That may be a bit of an overly protective critique, but it made me enjoy this episode a lot less than the others and less than many episodes to come. I'll give this episode 3 out of 7 Chaos Emeralds. A bit of a harsh rating, but the show had done a lot better by this point. Now, I do want to expand a bit more on some of the behind-the-scenes stuff with this episode, namely that I think this is the first Sonic episode not written by Ben Singer. This was always bound to happen with Death Battle becoming a bigger and bigger show over time. This is probably why the writing in this episode feels so different to the previous ones. This is just to say that my little theory from earlier isn't concrete. There are tons of things that influence the way people go about writing their projects. I can't know everything that went into it. Still, it does all kind of line up, and I do certainly think that the general reputation that the Sonic franchise had at the time at least influenced the way this episode was received. Next, we have a matchup that I actually really love, to the point that I'm collaborating on a project with some other people for it. Mewtwo versus Shadow. This matchup just has so much potential in terms of both the fight and the story leading up to it, and almost none of that potential was actually used in this episode. Starting with the rundowns, I think these are generally a big step down from DK Knuckles, despite the fact that I didn't even like that episode very much. The structure here leaves a lot to be desired. Whereas those rundowns bounced from giving lore to giving stats pretty freely, Mewtwo and Shadow's rundowns are pretty segregated into story and stats, which is a real shame as it means we get a lot less about who the characters actually are. They also focus a lot more on the artificial life form angle rather than the character consumed by grief and revenge that ends up turning good angle, which I think is the more interesting commonality between the pair. Not to mention that a lot of the dramatic bits of their stories are sort of played for jokes. Overall, this leads to both analyses feeling very limp, like a Season 1 matchup analysis as opposed to a more modern, sophisticated rundown. The fight animation is also just not great and not finished in some areas. There are a lot of little issues that kind of add up. The entire thing is more primitive than Luigi Tales was, with only one camera angle for essentially the entire fight. There are a ton of shots that feel awkwardly timed or choreographed. It just doesn't have the same energy, not only that other fights at the time had, but even some earlier fights had. From what I've heard, this episode was on a really tight schedule and it was essentially released completely unfinished. That does kind of scan given how awkward a lot of the animation is. It looks like something that just didn't have much time to be polished into a fluid final product. Though, I don't think more time would have completely saved this episode. Shadow feels oddly characterized here in general. I just can't buy any of the lines they have him say. Mewtwo feels more in character, at least from what I can tell. The fight generally lacks a lot of impact. Super Shadow and Mega Mewtwo don't feel like the substantial power-ups they should. Having Super get his mind wiped and playing it off as a joke feels really strange, and most of the fight just doesn't really work. I could go on for a while about why I like this matchup and why I feel like this episode doesn't do what I wanted, but I'll probably get another chance to go into more details on my thoughts on this fight soon enough, so I don't really think it's worth going into too much detail right now. This episode was a big disappointment considering what we know Death Battle was capable of doing at the time. 2 out of 7 Pokeballs, an unfortunate episode that I would love to see a follow-up on at some point. Amy versus Ramona is a matchup that I don't really like the concept of, and the execution does not sell me on it. It was a lot more common back in the day for matchups on Death Battle to just be 2 characters who had like one thing in common. Here it's just girls who have big hammers. I get that girls with big hammers is a surprisingly common character archetype, but I don't think that's enough to sell a matchup with. And the rundowns feel very disjointed from each other as a result. I honestly think the best part of the episode is Amy's rundown. It's pretty good. It doesn't fall into the easy jokes of Amy being a stalker too much, and they sell the idea of her growing into a useful member of Sonic's team pretty well. Most Sonic characters are really basic. You kind of have to try to mess them up. Ramona, on the other hand, has a really bad rundown. There are a lot of jokes that just take way too long to finish and end up smothering the analysis, which is really bad because Ramona is by far the more complex character here. Her story has a lot of complex emotional beats concerning relationships, trauma, and growing as a person. Basically none of which is even talked about here. Really, I don't think someone would even get much of an impression for what Ramona's personality even is from this analysis. You barely learn her role in the story, and even then, it's mostly just her role in Scott's story. At least Amy's rundown was from her perspective. Ramona only gets talked about in relation to what she means for Scott lore-wise. The glow, a big part of what's going on with her, gets mentioned as a joke right at the end. It's just a really bad rundown in relation to the rather decent one that Amy gets. The fight animation is also bad. I like the backing track, but that's really all that works for me. The sprites look good since they're pulled directly from their games, but the animation itself is awkward in so many places. A ton of big shots in the animation are just replaced with cutting away and having an effect or sound play to imply a strike happened. The sound design generally feels pretty lacking, or maybe it's just the lack of any vocals at all. I think even season 1 episodes had the characters make sounds when they got hit. I don't know why Amy and Ramona are completely silent all fight. It makes them feel like dolls and not real breathing people fighting each other. The final sequence is also weirdly slow. Every shot feels like it takes half a second too long to finish, and it makes the entire thing feel awkward. The entire fight just feels like a nothing burger. It's another 2 out of 7, bagels episode. It just isn't very fun. I do want to very quickly note that this episode also relies pretty heavily on Boom for clips and for some notes about Amy's characterization. They even bring up the plot with Justin Bieber to say that Amy can be a bit immature sometimes, which in retrospect feels really strange. I want to reiterate why this is important. While DB does use composite characters for most matchups, they usually lean more on the most popular or the canon material for a character when discussing them. The fact that they consistently chose to use Boom as a reference in this era of the show really does show how people saw Sonic at the time. This episode released only a couple months after Force's debut trailer, and I think it's worth noting that the next episode, which released 10 months later, basically doesn't use Boom as a major source for Metal Sonic's rundown. I mean, that's also probably partially because Metal Sonic doesn't appear that much in Boom, but I think the shift in how people saw the franchise shifting between the creation of those 2 episodes is also a contributing factor. Speaking of which, Metal Sonic vs. Zero. This one is also bad. The rundowns are generally fine, but there are a few key moments that stand out to me, mainly with some weird stuff they say with Metal Sonic. I want to state now that I think it's very fair to say that Zero wins this fight, and I don't want this to just come off as me defending the character I like from losing a fight on an internet show. I just want to say that I think it's so weird that they just make up Metal Sonic's copying abilities being imperfect to constantly act as if Zero has a bigger advantage than he does. Considering how OP time stops are, I understand wanting to go over any possible weaknesses Metal Sonic's Chaos Control may have. The problem is that the weakness they come up with just comes out of nowhere. We never see any indication that the abilities Neo Metal Sonic copies are weaker than the versions he copied them from, and furthermore, Zero has a time stop ability anyway, so this entire thing is pointless to make up in the first place. Like, I know I'm being especially autistic right now, but it's just so weird to me that they would even say this in the first place. There's some other weird scaling stuff, like they just don't scale Metal Sonic's speed to any of Sonic's speed feats, they don't scale Metal Sonic's durability to any of Eggman's other tech, or any of his stats to anyone else in the Sonic franchise. It sticks out to me more here since we're getting more properly into the stat-heavy and power-scaling style content of Death Battle nowadays. This episode is almost a weird middle ground where they start to lean more heavily on standard power scaling logic but didn't quite go all the way yet. That was honestly more power scaling nerd than I want this video to largely be about, so let's talk about the animation. This one is sad to me because it's like really close to being good. The animation usually looks fine, but anytime they try to use 3D models for a shot, it just looks so uncanny with the weird pixel art filter they put on top of it. There's also a few shots where they stretch the pixel art in ways that just looks wrong, like Neo Metal laughing in this shot looks terrible. I know there are a lot of people who also really can't handle the audio in this episode. It's not that bad for me, but the fight does have a lot of really loud, sharp sounds that start to grate on your ears after a while. On the same note, the entire fight is a bit visually busy in a way that kind of tires my eyes out. It keeps up a good energy most of the time, but there are a lot of places where there's just extra visual noise that only serves to make things harder to look at. This one is really sad to me because it's probably the closest one here to being a good episode. The rundowns are generally fine if you just remove the weird note about Metal Sonic's copying ability, and if you polish up the animation to look a bit better and not commit assault and battery on everyone's eardrums, the episode would be good. I'll give it 3 out of 7 energy tanks again. It sucks that it didn't turn out better, but I'm really close to actually liking it. Next, we have Sonic vs. Mario, the rematch, and to put it bluntly, this is my current least favorite episode of Death Battle. That honestly really sucks because it was their 100th episode and I liked the original. The rundowns are fine, they're actually pretty good. I don't have any complaints about them or too much to say in general, but man, this fight animation is awful. The best way I can describe it is a high budget dorkly skit, and I mean that in the most derogatory way imaginable. Mario and Sonic are both written like assholes in this fight for no reason. It feels like we're not watching these actual characters fight, we're watching a parody animation of them fight, and that's not the feeling I've gotten from Death Battle since the very earliest seasons. This is also the Sonic episode that revels the most in blood to its own detriment. I have no idea why they decided to have Sonic bleed at multiple points in this episode, but it's awful. It's not like bleeding in a cool way. It's very realistic and uncomfortable. And the scene where all the Cat Mario clones gang up on Sonic is just uncanny to watch. It reminds me of terrible animation parodies like Racist Mario. It's just gore for the sake of shock value. It doesn't make the characters look cool, and the joke is very old by 2018. I also don't think this is just me being too squeamish or anything. Like, as a random example, I've said before that I enjoyed MASH's There's Something About Amy series a lot more than I thought I would, and after rewatching the series, I do stand by that. It's similarly violent and bloody, but it at least serves a purpose there. It adds to the horror atmosphere that enhances the dark comedy of the series as well as raising the stakes of the drama. I don't mind it if it serves a purpose, but if you're only doing it to be edgy, then I don't care. I could talk about the conclusion and why I think parts of it are wrong, but I don't care enough to go on an entire spiel about that. I don't like how they treat Mario's power-ups as if they're infinite. I don't like how they treat Super and Hypersonic as if they're just invincibility and not something more substantial. And I really don't like that they keep making up bullshit reasons for Sonic characters to not be able to use Chaos Control when they absolutely can and it would work fine. People may accuse me of being upset Sonic lost if I get too defensive about it, but seriously, I don't care who wins as long as the logic behind the verdict makes enough sense and the episode is fun to watch. I just think that this episode falters on its logic a little bit, and it's actively unpleasant for me to watch the fight. 0 out of 7 Chaos Emeralds. This is a genuinely bad episode. Now, with that said, one thing I do want to point out at this point in the video is just the level of professionalism that Death Battle operated under at this point in the process. As much as I didn't end up liking this episode in the end, you can really tell that at this point they had it down to a science. I felt like episodes before this point were often influenced by the creator's bias. Episodes like Ragna vs. Soul Bad Guy are really infamous for that. But by this point, all of those rough edges have mostly been sanded off. People love to accuse Death Battle of bias, and Sonic as a franchise gets it quite bad thanks to the losing streak after the earliest seasons, but I really don't think that's coming into play to a substantial degree. I do want to quickly point out that at this point in the overall timeline, the air around the Sonic franchise was still quite sour. People weren't dunking on Sonic as much as they used to, but forces didn't do the series a lot of favors, so it hadn't quite bounced back from its earlier reputation. I think the biggest difference in the energy for the episodes comes not from the overall state of the internet, but just the cast at Death Battle learning how to work through whatever personal feelings they have for a property and deliver the best version of an episode, showing how cool both characters are, regardless of their own opinion. I feel like it may sound like I'm contradicting what I just said, but by best version of an episode, I mean the best version of whatever creative vision they had. The Mario vs. Sonic Death Battle is the best version of that creative vision that they could have done at that time. I just disagree with that vision, I guess. Next, we have Shadow vs. Ryuko, which is one of the few episodes in this marathon that I hadn't seen before deciding to make this video. The simple reason for that is that I didn't like the matchup very much. I've never actually seen Kill la Kill, and maybe Ryuko is a good opponent for Shadow, but it feels like people just saw a edgy black and red protagonist and paired her with Shadow on that basis alone. At least that was my thoughts before actually watching the episode, and now that I've seen it, I think that was a bit of an oversimplification. They do have some surface level similarities, but even just the rundowns in this episode show a lot of story beats in their stories that are parallel to each other pretty well. They were both unethical scientific experiments. They had a loved one die that spurred them on the path to revenge, and they grew through that to become heroes afterward. I kinda get it now. The matchup works on both a surface and deeper level. The rundowns are pretty good here too. They actually give the dramatic beats of both characters' stories some weight, and they're not all front-loaded in the analysis, but actually woven into their abilities more naturally. It makes them a lot more fun to watch. The only thing that I didn't love about the analysis were the low-hanging fruit jokes they relied on a tiny bit too much. The jokes about them being edgy and the fan service in Kill la Kill got old pretty fast, but luckily they don't lean on them too much, so it was only slightly tiring by the end of the rundowns and not actively annoying. They're some of the better rundowns we've gone so far. I think I prefer them to the rundowns in Mario Sonic just because the characters have some more dramatic meat to dig into. As for the fight animation, it's good but not amazing. The hand-drawn bits honestly don't look that great, and while I get why they want to use them for Ryuko's transformations, it feels like a waste to not get at least one of Shadow in the episode at all. It feels kind of lopsided to give all this extra attention to Ryuko, though honestly this kind of does make sense because this is likely the only episode Kill la Kill is going to get, and they wanted to do its crazy animation justice, which I do understand. The fight does have a lot of fun back and forth. It feels like both characters get a chance to really show what they can do, and both get the upper hand at different points. The only thing that really drags the episode down is that it's just not exceptional in any way. I think the only part that's really memorable is the ending sequence with the Maxima Scissor Blade, or whatever it's called. Ryoko's sayonara dipshit into Shadow just breaking the Scissor Blade has so much impact given the context of the rundowns and how we've been told that the Scissor Blade is both an incredibly powerful and important weapon. Also, small note, the last thing that all three of Shadow's opponents in Death Battle say to him is sayonara, which is pretty cute. I'm not necessarily the best person to analyze this episode as I'm only familiar with half of the combatants, but I at least felt like it did both characters justice and I had fun with it. I'll give it 5.5 life fibers out of 7. It's not exceptional, but it doesn't really make any missteps, and it has a few things in it that will stick with me, so I'd call it a success. My only concern would be that Kill la Kill fans may be disappointed, as this is probably Ryuko's only episode on the show. I've heard some people complain that they mischaracterized her in the fight, and that does suck. Still, it's just not something I can really comment on. Really quickly, I am not going to be talking about the Archie episodes, but I did watch the fight animation of Silver vs. Trunks at a friend's request, and I can confirm that it goes hard. I almost feel like they tried especially hard to make this episode as hype as possible, almost as like an apology for the losing streak Sonic had gone on the show. I don't have much to say outside of that though, so time for the grand finale. Bowser versus Eggman. Really quick, it's worth bringing up the context surrounding this episode, because while I don't think bias factored into its creation, the general perception of the Sonic franchise definitely played a role in how this episode was received, which is to say, spectacularly. This episode premiered in November of 2024, a month after Sonic X Shadow Generations and a month before Sonic 3 released in theaters. People in general were pretty excited for both of these projects. Sonic Frontiers had stabilized the general audience's opinion on Sonic games, but Shadow Generations made people excited for the games again. Obviously, it's a small thing in the grand scheme of video games, just a small pack into the re-release of Sonic Generations. But audiences and critics liked this game a lot more than previous Sonic games that had released running up to it. The news that Keanu frickin' Reeves was going to be playing Shadow and the trailers generally looking good for the new movie had made people even more excited. When that movie finally did drop a few weeks after this episode came out, people loved it. all of this hype surrounding the Sonic franchise, along with the general goodwill for Mario as a series, made people really excited for this episode, and then it fucking delivered. This is currently my favorite episode of Death Battle, with just a few other standouts like Simone Kyle competing for that top spot. The rundowns are the best we've seen so far. In general, the very recent episodes of Death Battle have really hit it out of the park with the rundowns, taking more time with them and generally going into more detail with the character's story and personality, to the point where they can really sell a character just by talking about them. They also look great. The editing in the rundowns has gotten really good. The rundowns sell Bowser's relationship with his kids and his army really well, and Eggman's rundown does a great job of building up how isolated he is, only to show Sage breaking through those walls for maybe the first time. It even creates some parallels that aren't immediately apparent. I doubt many people would look at this matchup and instantly think of how there's a parallel on how Bowser is defined by his connections to his army, who are sort of, or in some cases, literally his family, and Eggman's, whose army served only to isolate him from others further. I think it's genuinely really good writing, and it makes this matchup and its conclusion far more compelling. The fight animation is one of the best pieces of internet animation I've ever seen. It looks incredible, and every single one of the characters in it is brimming with personality. Infinite being outsmarted by King Boo and crushed by a thwomp is iconic. Metal's transformation into Neo Metal and later Super Neo Metal are awesome, and the entire thing just looks so good. I don't even feel like I really have that much to say about it, because all I can do is gush about how cool it is. It's charming, it's awesome, it's almost perfect, and I only say almost because I don't think perfection is attainable. It's a 7 out of 7. Home run of an episode. If you haven't seen it yet, go watch it. Stop watching this video right now and go watch it instead. It's much better. There are a lot of little things that I kind of wanted to point out through this whole exercise, both about Sonic as a franchise and about Death Battle as a web show. Obviously, the show itself has gone a lot better over time, but one of the most obvious changes is how Death Battle has gone from treating a lot of the episodes as a joke to taking things more and more seriously over time. It never lost that humor, but every character on the show is someone's favorite, and I think over time they've only come to understand that more and more. There's obvious effort given to showing both characters in each matchup and why they're so cool. More importantly, for our purposes at least, is how the way they talk about the Sonic cast changes with time. Death Battle does usually composite characters for its fights, but the Sonic cast, notably, relied heavily on pulling from sources other than the games for feats and to describe their characters. The Archie comics and Sonic X were cited a lot, and once the Boom era started, it kind of replaced those sources in a lot of Death Battle episodes. The only place that this isn't true, at least to some extent, is in the most recent Sonic episode, Bowser vs. Eggman, where basically everything they pull off for Eggman is from canon Sonic sources. I've talked about how Sonic's reputation as a franchise wasn't great in this video, but I think another interesting note is how disjointed the brand's image was for a long time. I think people forget how inconsistent Sonic seemed to general audiences before Sega's recent push to unify the brand. Sure, the average person could notice that Sonic X and Archie Sonic were clearly not canon to each other, but if they were the main canon, or if the games were in general canon to each other, was also up in the air. Outside of a few games that you could draw straight lines between, it was difficult for the average person to tell if post-Sonic 06 games were even in the same universe as the Adventure-era games. Colors Unleashed and the Storybook games don't mention any of those games' events directly, and Generations was, for a long time, the only thing connecting these threads. It wasn't helped by the fact that 06 makes no sense in current Sonic canon because it was supposed to be a reboot, but it failed so spectacularly that they abandoned that idea. The result is that until very recently, there wasn't actually a clear main Sonic timeline or continuity. The IDW comics have done a ton to establish that, yes, all of the games are canon to each other, and that this is the canon for the Sonic franchise. Returning to the main point about Sonic's reputation, I think the explosion of love for Bowser vs. Eggman really shows just how positive the reception to Sonic content is nowadays. I have seen some people claim that we're in another dark age of Sonic right now, and I just couldn't disagree more. This is maybe the best time to be a Sonic fan in the past 2 decades. We have more consistently good content for the franchise than we've ever had before, and while it is coming out more slowly, those two things are kinda linked together. I'd rather wait a couple more years for each Sonic game if it means making them better than they used to be, and I don't think the general atmosphere has ever been more welcoming to Sonic on the internet. It's kind of funny to me that just through the episodes of a silly internet show, you can almost see this play out in real time. Sonic started on a sort of pedestal from the classic era that slowly wore through the 2010s online, until slowly, thanks to both the changing culture online and Sega finally getting their act together, Sonic became a celebrated series again. I know that this whole video has been kind of disjointed, I'll admit, but it mostly served as a way to go back down this short bit of internet history and remember how far things have come. The internet is a wildly different place than it used to be, for better and for worse, and somehow Sonic remains relevant to the discourse despite so many other things having come and gone in that time period. Anyway, that's where I'm gonna wrap things up for now. Big shout out to all of my members: Elric111, Agent B7, Bokabara, Sonic Storm, Joseph Florian, Shredding Pixels, and GB484.